Well, welcome everybody to what was going to be a new episode of the Redeemed Imagination podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's one of the Anselm Society's 3 podcasts, which collectively are dedicated to a renaissance of the Christian imagination. The Redeemed Imagination podcast specifically focuses on the, to some extent, the more historical and theological side of it. Because we don't think that we have to do this from scratch when it comes to looking at things that modern artists or the modern church or the modern human aren't quite as good at as maybe at some other points in the past. There's some things we're better at, but there's some things we're worse at. If we're looking at the things that we're worse at where we could perhaps stand to grow, it's great to be able to look at the past. And we're currently, this is going to be a podcast, but as we planned it out, it just made more sense for it to be a live conversation that you all can participate in. And if the audio turns out well, we'll put it on the podcast anyway. But in the meantime, there's something very interesting here because we're in the middle of a series on the centric genius, kind of leading up to our what was going to be our in-person conference at Glen Erie and is now going to be our online Imagination Redeemed conference at the end of April. Well, as we talked about the idea of a centric genius, which is the idea that a genius or an artist specifically is someone who can actually thrive better in community, can thrive better in dialogue with the church, with tradition, either the tradition of their individual craft or the tradition of the theological tradition that they're in. It's kind of a countercultural notion. When we think of artists, we think of wild-haired, suicidal, 60s rock bands, or the frustrated Beethoven, or those sorts of things. But those are actually not. Those are the historical exceptions, actually. And historically, it was considered much more normal to have an artist be nicely integrated into a lot of other things, and for who they were as an artist to be a dialogue with a lot of things. And as we plotted the series out, one of the first people we thought of that we figured just had to be featured was Tolkien. We bust out Lewis or Tolkien pretty much anytime we want to be able to draw a crowd for something without making any effort whatsoever. And Tolkien's such a great example of this. And so to talk about Tolkien, we have brought in a Tolkien expert, Dr. Holly Ordway. So now that I've monologued with you on the screen here for 3 minutes, hi, Holly.
Hello. It's really a pleasure to join you for this.
Thanks for doing it. Okay, so before we get into Tolkien, though, tell us a little background about yourself.
Well, it's actually an exciting moment for me to introduce myself because I've just started a new position. I'm the new Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. So I've just transitioned out of about 8 years teaching cultural apologetics at Houston Baptist University. And actually, I'm still going to retain a connection with them as a visiting professor, which I'm pleased about. But now I'm really going full-time into ministry and full-time writing and speaking. And the most exciting thing about that at the moment, given our topic, is that Word on Fire is going to be publishing my book on Tolkien that I've been working on for about the past 7 years in a very sort of Tolkienian time frame. It's going to be published early next year by Word on Fire Academic, and it's called Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle Earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And in it, I look at everything that Tolkien read of modern literature, and by that I mean post-1850, everything he read, and by my count, I've got 136 different authors and over 200 different works gleaned from various sources. And what this has shown me is that Tolkien really was much more centric than we ever thought with regard to his reading and his engagement with modern culture. Typically, in all the scholarship and certainly in popular treatments of Tolkien, he's so often presented as stuck in the past, exclusively interested in medieval literature. It's said wrongly, he never said this. It's claimed that he said, there's nothing worth studying after Chaucer. He never said that, but it's assumed that he believed that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is his first serious biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, kind of had a chip in his shoulder and made these claims about it, which I talk about in detail in the book. But the truth of it is that Tolkien really was thoroughly interested in modern literature, everything from Isaac Asimov to James Joyce. And he read a lot of it, and he said very interesting things about it, and it shaped his writing and his creative imagination in some really fascinating ways. And so one of the aspects of his, well, of his genius really, is the fact that he's drawing very much on medieval literature, absolutely, very much on linguistic matters, absolutely, very much in his personal experiences, his experiences in the Great War, but also on his reading and engagement with modern literature, modern culture. And I think that's a really huge piece in understanding how it is that he speaks so powerfully to us today. Because otherwise, like, why would he have such a powerful voice? There are lots of reasons. He's a great writer, but I think this is one of the reasons. And I think it does tie right into that theme of the centric genius.
Okay, talk more about that, because I think it's pretty common for us to think of the history nerd as, by definition, not a centric person, someone who is kind of detached from reality. Maybe they're grounded in some sort of ancient tradition, whatever their favorite time period is, or the time period that's their area of expertise. But on the flip side, they often are seen as a little out of touch, or frankly, I mean, some of the wisest people I know when it comes to being able to speak intelligently about history and about literature or art from history and make you love it, sometimes are the ones who do sound the most out of touch when you ask them to talk about something specific in the day and age. That's a very, very rare gift, to see somebody who's that grounded in the past and that able to speak into the present. How did that play out for him?
Well, I think it plays out in a lot of ways in his writings that haven't really been sort of attended to. First of all, you do see in The Lord of the Rings this tremendous masterpiece of a book that, in one sense, is very medieval in its flavor. It's set in the past, and it has kings and that sort of thing. But if you think about it, the themes that it addresses are so deeply modern. Frankly, the central theme really is the abuse of power, or one of the central themes, I think we should say. And the whole point of getting rid of the ring, that's radical. And the Lord of the Rings has been become so much part of our culture that we forget what a reversal this is. Because historically, in the literature, in myth and legend, quests are to find something. They're to gain the magic ring, not to get rid of it. They're to gain the power, the item, the magic that's going to allow the hero to do X, Y, and Z. But Tolkien flips that on its head, and his entire story is about people who are saying, no, I cannot be trusted with this ultimate power. I can't. It's too much for me. Or trying to take it, and it is too much for them. And the rejection of the will to power. That is a deeply modern concept. And I don't think that anybody could have written the book the way that he did who hadn't lived through 2 world wars. He obviously, the First World War was the one that was the most profound for him as a young man. But he's writing The Lord of the Rings and thinking of it, during the Second World War as well. He's sending manuscripts to his son Christopher, who's serving in the Royal Air Force. So this is a fundamentally modern concept. And I think of the way that he engages with the abuse of technology. Now, this is, I think, a really critical point. He actually isn't rejecting technology per se. People often make that assumption. It's not the case. He's rejecting the abuse of technology, the use of it for power. He's rejecting scientism. In this sense, it's interesting, when I was writing my chapter on science fiction for the book, to find that Tolkien was much more up to date in technology than we ever would have expected. If you frame it to his time frame, he was using typewriters, which were actually technology. C.S. Lewis refused ever to use a typewriter. He always used just a dip pen. Tolkien not only had a typewriter, he had at least 3. Some of them specialized with special keyboards for the etymological symbols. He used a voice recorder to do things. He was quite keen on the BBC radio performances of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In fact, he even borrowed a voice recorder to practice reading so that he could go to the BBC in London and audition to see if he would be able to read the poem. He didn't, in the end, get chosen. But he was actually quite interested in using technology when he could. I think of, if he were alive today, he'd probably be perfectly happy to be having a Zoom call using, his iPad or whatever, unlike C.S. Lewis, who would have said, no, I want to have anything to do with that. It was the abuse of technology that he was really against, and in that he's very modern. But how does he express it? He expresses it through medieval sort of tropes and structures. And this ties into something that Eugene Naver once reported that Tolkien had said to him. Tolkien said, whenever I read a medieval story, my response is I want to write a modern work in the same form. And I think that's fascinating. And we see that in a lot of his other, shorter works, that he's immersed in medieval literature. And so he writes his own version for the modern day. He did this with Arthurian poetry, with The Fall of Arthur, for instance. And that, I think, is a fundamentally bridging kind of activity. He's not content just to read the old literature. He wants to do something new with it today. And I think that's, as you noted, is an element of genius in his character, because not everybody can do that, even if they want to.
Can you talk a little more about how the medievalist in him, the scholar of history and historical languages, fed into that? Because again, that isn't a normal instinct. It isn't a common instinct at any rate. This was one of the questions we had in advance of this, of us going live. Ashley Coles had asked what role his background as an Anglo-Saxon scholar, as an early medievalist, played in his development as the centric genius, as the person who was grounded enough to be able to speak into his time.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it really hugely had a huge part to play, because he was profoundly a medievalist. That was his specialty. He was a professor of medieval literature and language. And I think what I would characterize as so important about that is that he was really immersed in it. He didn't see the medieval text as those old things that I'm going to look at, as a specimen. He read them and enjoyed them as literature. And we take this for granted. But one of the things that Tolkien did that literally transformed his field was the lecture he gave called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, in which he basically takes down contemporary approaches to Beowulf. Because at that point, up until the 1930s, when he gave this lecture, the poem Beowulf was not treated as literature. It was treated as this sort of weird curiosity, kind of weird, like here you have this historical story and there's a dragon in it, what the heck? People were actually dissing it and saying, and by people I mean critics, medievalists, saying, oh, this is just a waste of time. It's only valuable because it gives us effectively a database of archaic vocabulary and names. And so they were using it, basically as a mine, as a quarry to pull out bits of, etymological data. And Tolkien, who knew that angle of the field to the nth degree, this is how he could do it. He could do that so well. He came and he said, it's a both and. We can learn so much about this, but we mustn't overlook the fact that it's a cracking good story. And he makes the case for it as a unified story, as a work of literature. And it is, and he won it over. And that is why today Beowulf appears on reading lists. That's why Seamus Heaney did a translation of it. We take this kind of for granted. There's a film, dreadful film versions of it. It has become recognized as a good story. That is something that Tolkien did, because he challenged the idea that medieval texts were only suitable for dissecting. And I think this is where we get at the centric part of it. He saw stories as stories. He saw language as something to be immersed in. Fellow Inkling Owen Barfield once said that Tolkien had been inside language. And I think that he immersed him so much in it that it wasn't something that he looked, to borrow C.S. Lewis's phrase, he didn't look at it all he could. He looked along it. and he could really immerse himself in it. So I think, in a way, his deep immersion in medieval literature as literature is what allowed him to bridge it, because he was immersed in it.
That feels like a very Catholic perspective to me, a very Roman Catholic perspective to me, the idea of looking along it rather than at it. I mean, honestly, 3 or 4 different things that you've said in the last 2 minutes. Anselm Society is an ecumenical organization. We've got Catholics and every stripe of Protestant and Eastern Orthodox. And one of the things that um, we do have this idea of in non-essentials charity, but we also really like looking at what particular traditions have brought to the Christian imagination. So if I have an artist that comes to me and says, I'm Presbyterian and I have such and such an art form, that allows us to, in some cases, be honest about a situation where their tradition doesn't have a strong background with that art form. But a lot of the time, it allows us to help them look at their particular theological tradition and say, well, great, well, you're a novelist. Well, how can you be a great Presbyterian novelist? How can your theology inform what you do? Can you talk a little bit about Tolkien's Catholicism in this respect?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great insight, because Tolkien, as I'm sure your listeners know, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. He was a convert as a boy when his mother Mabel became a Catholic, and then he also was received and was raised up in the faith, and he kept it all his life. He was very serious about his faith throughout his entire life, and I think, this is such an important aspect of his work, and it's something that I plan to write about in the future as well. I don't think there's been enough really to deal with it, because too often I think responses to Tolkien's faith go in one of 2 directions. One, they dismiss it entirely and they say, well, I don't want to even think about that. We'll just look at the story as story. Okay, but that's missing out a lot. And the other is to kind of get too specific and say, well, let me find all the ways I can connect it specifically to Catholic theology, and they become a little bit too, it can even go to the extent of kind of making Lord of the Rings into an allegory, which it's not. So there's these 2 extremes, but in the middle, there's this huge area where his faith informs his writing in really deep underlying ways. And I think this is one of them, that he has this integration of vision, which is deeply Catholic, because this idea of the sacramental imagination, that, that there's a sense that the world matters, right? And that this is something that, we bring into the faith. It's a both and. It's a great Catholic both and. Both our material things and the spiritual realm are both important because of the incarnation. And I think that probably is, yeah, I think that is reflected in the way that he engaged with all of his literature that he read and studied.
Nice. I'm going to drop the thread of the conversation a little bit, because we've got a lot of great questions coming in from the attendees. So we'll go to the lightning round here and start sharing your questions. Okay, I'm going to go out of order because this one looks like fun. Elizabeth asked, what would be Tolkien's criteria for adding new words to the English vocabulary? What would be the difference, in other words, between slang, for example, and something durable?
Oh, that's a great question. Highly speculative. So let's just put on the little flag of I'm going to just speculate wildly here.
Yes.
Well, I think he was interested in meaning, and how do these words get conveyed. He was very attentive to linguistic elements. He's very attentive to names of things, and you see that in the names, for instance, in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits. So I think that he would be interested in seeing, how well does a word convey a new meaning? Does it work? And slang, tends to be, it tends to not last very long, because it doesn't have robust roots in meaning. It has associations, and those associations pass, and then they go. So I think he would be interested in whether there was kind of a connection of that new word to, its roots that could enable it to kind of be solid. That would be my thought anyway.
Nice. Sounds plausible. David Fitzgerald asked, he brought up the issue of Tolkien's impact on other science fiction and fantasy writers, he always pops up towards the top of the list as far as influence. You talk to almost anybody who is in, well, not just writing, art and graphic novels and that sort of thing. If you're remotely in the science fiction fantasy space, typically you're going to list Tolkien as one of your influences. What is it about Lord of the Rings that has been so influential on all of these people? What's so different?
Well, that's such a big question, and in a way, that is the question that helped spark me on my basically 10-year journey to write this book. Where did the Lord of the Rings come from? Why is it so powerful? And I think there are a lot of answers to that question. One of them is, frankly, because it's just so well written. Tolkien is a fantastic writer. He's so skilled at everything from the architectonics of the story. I mean, if you think about it, the Lord of the Rings is an incredibly complex book in terms of narrative structure. If you think about what's going on in the Two Towers, and the way that everything is interleaved, he's actually using a medieval technique, interlacing, but he's just bringing it to a peak of modern usage. He's using very sophisticated metatextual devices. There's elements of almost postmodern literary technique. You've got Sam and Frodo reflecting on the story that they're in, which is so postmodern in its self-reflectivity. He's got such a deft hand with description and indeed with characterization, which is an interesting thing. People, I think, give him short shrift on his characters, I think, because they're looking more at the imitations of Tolkien that had these cardboard characters. But in fact, if you look at his actual characters, you see a lot of depth, so much more than you would ever imagine from a text that's rooted in medieval tradition. So there's all this complexity. There's all these themes in it. It's such a fantastically well-written book. It's also, that's a huge part of why it's so important. It's just a great book. But it also, I think, speaks to these modern issues, these modern points in a way that really, I think, gets to the heart of it. It's what Tolkien is very clear that it's not an allegory, but he says it has applicability, and he's very keen on that. There's so much applicability of what's going on to our present day, to our experiences. And I think that's a big part of what makes it so powerful. And also, in terms of the genre, he's not the first person to write a secondary world story, but he makes it so much more effective than anybody else who had done it. It's so much more believable. He's not the first person to have elves and dwarves, in a modern novel, but he gives them this history and this depth that you hadn't seen before. So all these things he does so well, and he puts them all together, and you have this fantastic book. And I think everyone, it's like a bombshell, really. No one knew what to do with it at first. And interestingly, in terms of influence, this is going to sound strange, but actually, The Lord of the Rings has had kind of a bad influence on the genre of fantasy, because everyone was so flabbergasted by it that they started imitating him. And so we get, the 1970s, frankly, for fantasy literature is kind of a nuclear wasteland. I'll just be blunt. Because everybody's just scrambling to replicate the success of The Lord of the Rings. And some of it's passable, some of it's dreadful, and I won't specify so that you won't feel offended if you happen to have a liking for one of the ones that I don't like. But it's all very imitative. And then you get into the 80s and you get the imitation of the imitations. And, as you well know, Brian, that's no way to do art. You got to be inspired by the great works, but you've got to go about it your own way. And I think what we see in a lot of fantasy after Tolkien is people jumping to imitate him, but not having anything remotely like the literary grounding that he had. They're trying to do the same kind of thing without like any of the tools. And then that becomes sort of a set pattern, and people kind of get locked into it, that this is how a fantasy story has to be. Just take one example. The Lord of the Rings is one book. It happened to be published in 3 parts because of just the publication process. That's just coincidence. Tolkien himself divided into 6 sections. But after that, the idea of trilogies is a thing. Tolkien inadvertently did that. The fact that we have a trilogy as a sort of default mode for a fantasy or even science fiction story, that's an imitation of Tolkien's quite coincidental happenstance structure for the physical volume of the Lord of the Rings. So these are all ways in which he's had such an influence that hasn't been great. And I hope that we can break away from the imitation of him to the emulation of him, in the sense of how can we do great things the way he did great things.
This is so interesting to me, because my experience has been that, so I've worked in the nonprofit fundraising world for a long time, and one of the things that I'll talk about sometimes is the difference between heroes and superheroes. And so let's say you're doing a fundraising banquet, and you want to honor somebody from the stage. Well, that's going to be the superhero. That's going to be the person where you look at them and they're so impressive in the field of whatever this organization values, that you look at them and you go, it's almost paralyzing. They've done this thing so well that you think, oh, well, I could never be that good. And so you don't do anything. And so it's important to build in heroes between you and the superheroes who are more manageable, right? You need the Frodos and Sams between you and the Aragorns. And it's so interesting that Lord of the Rings could be so daunting, could require decades of scholarly expertise building and all of this 10 years of work. And for, instead of paralyzing generations of fantasy writers, for it to turn them on like that. That's sort of fascinating thing number one for me, because it seems like such an exception. And then, yeah, fascinating thing number two is the imitation piece. It dominates the genre so much that it is very difficult to find a fantasy writer who knows how to write anything that isn't heavily derivative of Lord of the Rings. So, okay, I'm an aspiring fantasy writer or graphic artist or composer or something. Where do I begin? What is it about Tolkien that I can kind of hone in on and go, oh, I'm going to imitate this, or there's this thing about him that I can focus on in trying to develop, as opposed to just looking at his whole scope of work and going, copy and paste without even realizing I'm doing it.
Right. And actually, and it's not even just Tolkien. We see this with C.S. Lewis too. I mean, how many, imitations of the Screw Tape Letters have there been? Too many. How many stories are there in which, child characters go through some sort of doorway into another world? Too many, so we do see this. Anytime you've got a superhero like that, you're going to get this sense of imitation. And Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has certainly done that for fantasy. I think the key here is, and I sort of hit on a phrasing of imitate versus emulate. And I think the problem comes when people try to just sort of copy the superficials. So for instance, he's got a fellowship of mixed races, working together to accomplish a goal. Well, I think the wrong way to go about it is to say, well, okay, he had elves and dwarves and hobbits and humans and, and a wizard. Well, I'll just swap them out and I'll have, I don't know, dragons and lizards and whatnot. I'm just making that up. Yeah, that would be the wrong way to go about it, because that's just imitating, that's copying and just sort of swapping out some of the pieces, and it's not getting at the heart of what made it what it is. But I think, and I don't think we can avoid, and we shouldn't try to avoid influence. Influence is not a bad thing. It's what you do with it that matters. I mean, this is the whole heart of the book that I've just written. Influence is, how do you use it? Influence can occur in lots of ways. It can occur by, taking up the idea, by responding to it differently, by saying, yes, but I want to do it this other way, by opposition, by all sorts of ways you can respond to something, and it's an influence. Shakespeare is an influence on, Western literature, and it's, this is important, this is good. So how do you respond to an influence in a good way? I would say first of all, by looking at the sort of deeper things. What are the things that really move us about the Lord of the Rings? What are the themes that he engages with? Well, he himself said that the big theme of the Lord of the Rings is death and the desire for deathlessness. Well, that's a theme that's worth grappling with, and I think we could well imitate the attention to that theme. And how will we do it? We'll do it in lots of different ways. So if we can take Tolkien's influence, say, let's take the theme of death seriously, let's explore this theme in literature in all sorts of ways, that would be a very positive way of responding to the influence of Tolkien. If you look at the
Potter books, I mean, if you could look at Lord of the Rings and then Harry Potter in that respect with the death and deathlessness thing, and you see Harry Potter not copying Tolkien.
Yeah, I mean,
engaging with that theme.
Exactly, and the Harry Potter books, I don't think they're brilliantly written, but I think they're good. They're solidly written, and I think that this actually touched on a reason why they have been so successful. It's because they aren't just copying. Now they do draw on all sorts of sources, like school, boarding school stories, all sorts of other stories. Of course. Dumbledore is a very Gandalf-like figure. Yeah, okay. But fundamentally, Rowling is addressing these deeper themes, and she's doing it in her own way. And I think that is a fruitful kind of responding to influence. Would Rowling have been able to write the Harry Potter books in a world in which the Lord of the Rings didn't exist? Who knows? They certainly wouldn't look like they look like now. But she's able to work within the tradition with Tolkien's influence, but in a way that isn't just copying it. You don't get, you don't get 9 kids going on a quest, right? So I think that's part of how you get at this influence. And the other part is to look at how did he do what he did. And Tolkien is writing from a perspective of really deep engagement with literature. He had read so widely, he had read so deeply. And I think that that's a piece that's, it's what I always have told my creative writing students. You've got to read, and you've got to read more than just in your genre. You've got to read widely and deeply. You've got to you got to know your way around a sentence. Tolkien is a fantastic writer. He was writing ever since he was a boy. You've got to be able to know the craft, and you've got to be able to know literature. And that deep knowledge and familiarity takes time and effort. You can't just snap your fingers and say, right, yep, I've got it. You've got to read and read widely. And I think that's something that we should do more of, and creative writers should do a lot more of.
We've got a half dozen awesome questions that I want to get to, but there's one that was asked actually before we even started that I want to make sure. Greg Brown asked, what's the role of music in Lord of the Rings? And do we know if Tolkien heard of any of the musical compositions based on the trilogy and what he thought of them?
Now, I will note that music is not really my area, so my answer is going to have to be much less complete than it would be otherwise. Tolkien himself, he wasn't a musician, but he greatly appreciated music, and his wife Edith was an accomplished pianist, so he really had a great appreciation for music. And in the Silmarillion, we see that he recasts the Genesis account in terms of music, which I think is very interesting. And so he's really interested in music as a mode of expression. In The Lord of the Rings, there's lots of songs that we get as the lyrics. Now, interestingly, Tolkien actually did have a sense of what they would sound like, and he worked with a composer, Donald Swann, to do some settings. In fact, I've got a copy which I prepared to show. The Road Goes Ever On, a song cycle, music by Donald Swann, poems by J.R.R. Tolkien, and he actually worked with Swann to set these songs to music.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and Swann, and interestingly, Swann was part of the duo of Flanders and Swann, who was a comic musical artist. They did funny songs. You can find them on YouTube, and he loved them. He thought they were great. He actually invited them to do a performance at Merton College. So here he is. He's basically up on popular culture. It's really as if he knew Stephen Colbert. If he were today, they were like that equivalent in his day. and he chooses one of them. He approves to do this musical work with him. So I think it's an interesting tidbit, and I don't know much more than that. So I will leave it to others to follow up on that some more.
All right, we'll make sure we link to the book in the show notes when we put this video up after the live stream. Terry asked about women characters in Lord of the Rings, specifically Éowyn. She asks, what do you think about her place in the story? Entering the battle and achieving an important victory? Was Tolkien challenging the culturally accepted role of women? I'll kind of add to that. I think this is a fascinating question, because you can end Éowyn's story with her killing the Lord of the Nazgul, and it's a heroic feminist thing. You can end with her kind of learning her lesson, so to speak, after that, and going home and make it a hyper conservative in the wrong sense of the word thing. Oh, good, she's going back home to behave herself now. I think my instinct is that Tolkien's view on gender roles is more complex than either, but I want to hear what you think.
Yes, and this is such a great point, because Tolkien's, as you said, Tolkien's view on women much more complex than people think. It is a sheer canard that he disliked women or had a misogynistic attitude. Completely false. It's also completely false, inaccurate that he was only surrounded by men. This is an idea that gets floated around like, oh, he was in the male-only world of the Oxford Inklings. Well, he was married, which wasn't the case with all the Inklings. He was married for a very long time. He had 4 children, of which one of them was a daughter, of whom he was extremely proud. And he sent all of his children, including his daughter, to Oxford. So he supported university education for his youngest daughter as well as for his sons. Even though I will add, they never had money. They were always, it was always financially tight for him until The Lord of the Rings became a big success. So it wasn't like he was rolling in dough and could just be like, oh yeah, go to college, no problem. So he supports university education. And indeed, one of the just sort of subsidiary things I turned up as I was doing research for Tolkien's modern reading is that he actually had a lot more professional interactions with women than has been noticed. Everyone has kind of been operating under the assumption that he didn't know any women, so everything that contradicted that was an exception they didn't mention. But for instance, he worked very closely with Ida Gordon to prepare an edition of one of the medieval texts he was working on. He started with her husband, he died, he continued working with his widow, who was quite competent, did that. One of his students, Simone Dardenne, he became actually a close family friend, and he was extremely supportive of her work. He actually helped 2 of his students from Leeds, 2 of his women students, get jobs at the Oxford English Dictionary. So he's helping his students professionally to make their way in the profession. He tutored a lot of women and as an Oxford John, which was not the case for every professor. Not everybody was interested in being a tutor for the women students. Some of them had very bad attitudes about it. Tolkien didn't. He had a good attitude about it. It's a very famous letter. He's quoted as saying that he's slightly frustrated that his women students don't seem to be able to go on as high as his male students, as if that meant that he thought that was a good thing. Like, what? No, he's actually making an observation. He's noticing the glass ceiling. It was a fact that most of his women students weren't going on to do the kind of work. He notices it. He's trying to figure out why. So this actually means that he's attentive to the careers of his women students. It actually means the reverse of what people often take it as. He cared. Slightly puzzled, but he cared. And he's involved, the Inklings is only men, but he was involved with other societies in Oxford that included women. So he's actually much more connected. He had good friends on the English faculty, the head of St. Margaret's Hall, for instance. So he's actually much more connected with women and worked with women and supported women. And I think all of this is to lead into to say, Éowyn is Éowyn. She's the character. So I think we are doing Tolkien a disservice to try to make Éowyn some sort of poster child for any particular ideology, whether it's radical feminism or radical conservatism or what have you. He has created a character, and she's a great character. She's one of my favorite characters in the book. And I think what it really shows us about Tolkien's views on women is look at how complex she is. she's conflicted. She's got mixed motives. She doesn't, she wants, she's kind of in love with Aragorn, but it's really kind of a puppy love. It's an admiring love. It's not real. Aragorn knows that, but it's still awkward and embarrassing for both of them. That's in there. Now, interestingly, one of Tolkien's sources, one of the books that he engages with, is a book called The Roots of the Mountains by William Morris, in which there's a character quite a lot like Éowyn, as a story arc very similarly. But Morris's treatment of her is much shallower. It's flatter. When we get to what Tolkien does, it's so much more sophisticated. And look at, for instance, Theoden, when they go off to Helm's Deep, oh, Éowyn is left behind. Well, can we read that as, oh, the woman has to stay at home? No, we shouldn't, because what actually Theoden has done is made her basically the ruler in his absence. Because he doesn't have a son, she's taken the place that his son would take. She's having a really crucial role of authority, and all of his men are happy about that. They're like, hooray, Éowyn's going to lead us. So we have really an affirmation of a woman leader, and she's doing a hugely important role. He's going off to fight, okay, but she's making sure his people don't get slaughtered. This is significant. And then we have, her sort of recklessness. It's not her going to fight the Nazgul is actually quite sort of psychologically ambivalent. Was this a good thing for her to do? She's abandoning her post, yet good comes out of it. And again, this is very much Tolkien's view of providence. God can bring good things out of even conflicted motives. So she is able to kill the king of the Nazgul. This is a really great thing, but she's done it out of very out of inner turmoil. She's got a death wish. She wants to die in battle. That's not emotionally healthy. So then we see her, when she recovers and she falls in love with Faramir, and it's real love. It's no longer this, this projection of her desires onto Aragorn. What I think we're seeing is Tolkien giving a very mature treatment of a woman healing, recognizing her own conflicted nature, and deciding that she wants to be creative and healing rather than destructive. And I think that's a healing of her own inner split. Now, does he ever even suggest that it was a bad thing that she, knew how to fight? No, absolutely not. She took down the Lord of the Nazgul. That's awesome, with Mary's help. But he's not going to rest in that simplistic thing. He's saying, and then, because then, this is what all of us go through. There's always an and then to our story. In some ways, the more flat version of the story would have had her dying heroically. It's very much what some of his sources would have had done. She would have died heroically, when fighting. But instead, Tolkien says, well, what happens when you have your climactic battle and you live through it? That's such a much more sort of emotionally, psychologically, spiritually complex thing. Right. And Éowyn as a character moves to a place of healing and growth. So that's Éowyn the character. So I think we can't take it as saying anything political one way or the other, but it certainly shows that Tolkien could write really strong, well-developed, well-rounded women characters and give them really important roles and significant positions of authority and be quite happy with that.
Yeah. Do you happen to know, Ashley asked this, and I was curious about this as well. Do you happen to know if he liked T.S. Eliot's work? We know Lewis didn't.
Yeah, this is actually quite an interesting question. He knew T.S. Eliot's work. We don't know what he thought of it. It seems to me probable from the evidence that he thought better of it than Lewis did, because he mentions in a late letter, he mentions T.S. Eliot's death, amongst other things that have grieved him. So we get the sense that he's sort of sorry that he's passed. And there's a really ridiculous epitaph that John Masefield wrote for Eliot, and Tolkien critiques it and calls it, it's not very good verse. And I actually tracked it down. I've quoted it in the book. It's rubbish. It's ridiculously inappropriate for Eliot. And I think the fact that Tolkien was kind of irked by the inappropriateness of it shows that he had I think, some respect for Eliot, and that he knew that this sort of sentimental verse wasn't fitting for this very unsentimental poet. So these are very tenuous bits of evidence, but it's given we don't have a complete collected letters, we've got very incomplete information. What we do have are hints that he seems to have, he knew Eliot's poetry, and he seems to have had at least a modestly favorable or acceptable view of them.
Seems like they both had a little bit of I hadn't thought about this until you mentioned it, but it does seem like they both had a little bit of that postmodern instinct. You can't, Eliot's poetry is incredibly contemporary poetry, but you can't understand 98% of what he's doing unless you are as well versed in theological and literary tradition as he is, and that does sound a bit like Tolkien.
And it's interesting because there's, as I talk about this much more in my book, but Carpenter's biography makes the completely false claim that he didn't read modern literature, and that's had such a knock-on effect. People have assumed that was the case. But if you look at the way critics were writing about Tolkien before Carpenter's biography was published, you actually get some really fascinating things. Like I have one critic that I found who was straight up comparing The Lord of the Rings to The Wasteland. He's seeing the connection. He's putting it alongside it as a major work of the 20th century. And that kind of comparison got lost later because people got stuck in this idea that, oh, he must have been only a medievalist. But actually, the work that was being done in the 50s and 60s was willing to actually look at Tolkien's work and say, oh yeah, Eliot. It's interesting.
Fascinating. Huh. Elizabeth asked, what were Tolkien's thoughts on an anti-hero?
Well, I don't know. He doesn't use that term, and I think anti-hero is a sort of very modernist kind of idea. This idea that we can have a protagonist who was terrible, and yet we're supposed to be sort of the hero.
Protagonist, yeah.
Yeah. And the protagonist is a neutral term, but the whole idea of anti-hero, I think would, now here I enter speculation. I think it goes against sort of Tolkien's theological understanding of storytelling. Have a conflicted hero, sure. Have various characters who, are struggling or doing, bad things. But to have a hero who's the anti-hero is that's I think a very different vision of how stories work theologically than Tolkien would have done. Now, having said that, I immediately wanted to say that doesn't mean that his heroes are all these, perfectly, Galahad, unconflicted sorts of heroes. I mean, Aragorn is racked by doubt, for instance. He doesn't know, he spends a lot of the book not really knowing what he's supposed to be doing until he comes into his own. Boromir is such an interesting character because, he means well, but that's not good enough. He means well, and yet he ends up, trying to seize the ring and getting killed and yet redeeming himself. And so he's such a conflicted figure because we kind of get where he's coming from, and yet we have to say, yeah, but Boromir, no, this isn't the right way to go about it. So Boromir is maybe the figure that would come closest to that. It's as if Boromir were the hero of the Lord of the Rings, then he would be an anti-hero. But I think Tolkien wouldn't have seen him as a fitting hero, so to speak. Just as Gollum, very interesting character, very conflicted, but he's not the hero. I think that's his theological underpinnings would put them in a different role.
Right. I've got two more questions that kind of go together. They're not the same question, but I think I can lump them together because there's going to be some crossover in the answer, perhaps. And then I have a very important final question before we wrap up. So the two questions, one, Alicia asked if you could talk about how Rover Andum fits in with the rest of Tolkien's work. And Jay had asked for some of the other influential elements in Tolkien's work outside of Beowulf, which you've already mentioned.
Oh, this is a great question. Because outside of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, his smaller works are a little underappreciated. And so with Rover Andum, we actually get one of those other influences. We get the influence of his family, because Rover Andum was a story that he told to console his son Michael, who lost a toy dog on the beach when they were on a family holiday. And he was devastated. They went back and they looked for the toy dog and they couldn't find it. And so Tolkien, who was a great father, he did the good dad thing. His son is devastated. He makes up a story about how actually the toy dog didn't get lost, but got, transformed into a living dog and went on all these adventures and went to the moon and had all these cool things going on. Such a delightful story. It's a charming story, well worth getting. And he illustrated it too. He did some really delightful paintings for it. And it comes out of a story that he made up and told to his children, and it came out of this encounter with consoling his son. And so the family context is a really important source for his work, because he was a family man. He was very much a family man, and this I really want to underscore. And that's something I liked. The Bodleian Tolkien exhibit, Maker of Middle Earth, did a really good job of showing that aspect of his life. The Father Christmas letters, 20 years of letters that he wrote each year to his children. They're amazing. They're such works of artistry. They're so full of creativity, and he did them and painted these wonderful artworks purely out of love for his children. It's tremendously touching to see this man who was always pressed for time. He could have been working a lot of other things, and he did these letters for his children. So I think the family context is a huge part of his inspiration. And another part of his inspiration, influence on him, is definitely World War I. This is a hugely formative influence on him. And you can't overstate that. And actually, the seminal work on that will be John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War. And that's certainly a book I would recommend to your readers, to your audience. And also, his family, the Great War. We already talked about his academic work as being an influence. Also, his association with the Inklings, that group of friends, hugely important. And for that, I would recommend your audience look at Diana Gleyer's book, The Company They Keep, or the shorter version, Bandersnatch. And it's about the creative collaboration of the Inklings. And that, I think, is such a hugely important element. He did not work in Ivory Tower. He worked in the context of his family, in the context of his friends. He wouldn't have, he even says of C.S. Lewis that he owes him the unpayable debt, that he would never have finished The Lord of the Rings without his encouragement. And I think we need to hear that. I, as a writer, deeply need my writing community, my friends, for the encouragement, for the help, for the looking at my drafts. We need this kind of community, and Tolkien really lived it.
Thanks for that. So I do have one last final question that Greg made sure that wanted to make sure that I asked. And this is something that we've asked other people before, and I think we may need to make a tradition of it. And for this, I can blame Matt Mellema, the host of our Believe to See podcast. If you were a Lord of the Rings character or race, who or what would it be?
Well, that's actually very easy, and I would be Éowyn, Shield Maid of Rohan. I fenced competitively for almost 20 years, saber fencing, and that's actually a big theme in my memoir, Not God's Type, in which, in fact, I have a quote. An Éowyn quote as my post-book epigraph. So I definitely identify with Éowyn. And actually, interestingly, this ties back to my other answer, because I gave up fencing. I retired from fencing when I moved to Houston to work for HBU, because I realized that I needed to really commit more to writing, that this is where God was calling me, that I wanted to do more writing, and that I can't do everything, shockingly. We only have 24 hours in the day. And I realized that although fencing had been a really important part of my life, a great part of my life, very fruitful, spiritually, friendship-wise, it was just great fun. It was time for it to come to an end. That chapter had to close. And so I retired from fencing in 2012. And that was kind of a big deal for me because it had been such a big part of my life. But it was very much so that I could go on and do this new thing, this constructive thing. And I've seen the way that my writing has flourished. I've been able to do so much more writing, and I really have felt that, yes, this is indeed the vocation that God has called me to, this work. So it meant that when I was picking this post-book epigraph, that the move that Eowyn makes from being a fighter to being a cultivator actually resonated very deeply with me, because in a way that is the move that I made, that I was a fighter, and now I was going to make a move to someone who cultivated, who nourished, and that's, so I see Eowyn as a kind of a figure to identify with in lots of different ways.
Thanks. Addendum to that last question, since we started a couple of minutes late, tell us a little bit more about the backstory behind Not God's Type. I'm going to tease it because I want everyone to go read it. So you don't need to summarize it, because I know that would take 10 minutes just to do the tiny summary, but why would you write a memoir called Not God's Type?
Well, because I'm a convert, and I am a rather unlikely one, because I'm an adult convert. And when I was already had my PhD, I was 30, I was teaching English literature, and I was a hardcore atheist, thought Christianity was a stupid superstition. And well, here I am now, and I'm a Catholic apologist working for a major ministry, and I just spent 8 years teaching apologetics at a Baptist university. How did I get here? And that's really what Not God's Type is about. It's about the how on earth did I get here? And it was not what I would have expected, because I would have considered myself to be not God's type. And the subtitle of the book is An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms. So you can see that there's that fencing motif that also has the spiritual motif of, the laying down of arms in there as well. So that's my teaser for the book.
Great. I just posted the link in the chat so everyone can go buy it. You should definitely all read it.
That's the wrong link you posted.
Is it?
Yes, there's actually 2 versions of the book. I wrote it actually in 2008, and it was published by Moody Publishers. And then when I became a Catholic, they decided that they couldn't publish me anymore, and so they dropped it. And then I was picked up by Ignatius, who gave me the opportunity, I'm so grateful, gave me the opportunity to revise it, and I completely overhauled the book. I had that great privilege that few authors get, of being able to treat a published book as a rough draft. And so the book that I wrote is it's longer, it's richer, it's got more in it, and it tells more of the story. And that's the Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms. It's from Ignatius Press. It's got the blue cover with a bookshelf on it, and that's the one.
Yes. All right. I just posted that corrected link.
Good.
Great. And is there anything else that our viewers or listeners should know about where to find more of you and your work?
Right. Well, since you're going to give me the opportunity, I do have a book on apologetics called Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. And that really came out of my teaching at HBU, and, sharing, sort of about the principles behind using imagination in apologetics. And so that's something that your readers might be interested in. There's a fair bit of Tolkien in there. And also I would invite readers, or viewers rather, to take a look at the Word on Fire Institute, which is my new position. And I'll actually be writing for Word on Fire's blog, but also for their new journal, Evangelization and Culture, which goes out to the Institute subscribers. And I'll be doing video courses and things for the Institute. So I think it's a great endeavor. That's why I went on board with them. So I'm very excited about that, and I would encourage them, if you're interested, check out the Institute.
All right. Well, Holly, thank you so much for spending time with us.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me on. This is great fun to discuss this. As you can tell, I really love this stuff. So thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. And for the rest of you, as I noted at the beginning, we have taken the Imagination Redeemed conference online, which, among other things, means we can kind of do whatever we want on in terms of speakers, because we're no longer limited to who can physically be in a specific place at a specific time. So if you want to hear more from Holly and you want to lobby us to have her participate in the conference or other speakers, by all means, let me know. And you can get your free tickets for the conference at imaginationredeemed.com. Thanks, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.